Hello, you're listening to Rot-Weiss-Rot Report, a podcast for those who live and work in Austria. Every week, we tell you about the main events and news, short and clear, so you stay informed about important changes that affect your work, documents, and everyday life. Today's episode covers the dramatic finale of the country's biggest espionage scandal. A former counterintelligence agent has been convicted of passing secret data to Russia. Another scandal in Parliament. Politicians clashed over a single word. What's this about? VAT is falling. The tax is being reduced on milk, bread, eggs, and vegetables. How much will your supermarket bills actually decrease? Refugee reforms. Burgenland has introduced mandatory community work, and Lower Austria is tightening requirements for foreigners. What do you need to know? We'll also tell you about a curious incident in Tyrol, Austria's major cultural victory, and much more. And we'll start, as always, with the main events of the past week.
One of the important political events for Austria took place on May 21st. The new Prime Minister of Hungary, Péter Magyar, arrived in Vienna on his first official visit. Chancellor Christian Stocker greeted him with military honors at the Hofburg Palace. Expectations from the visit were high, as the Austrian government and businesses are concerned about special taxes, Sondersteuern, special taxes. The previous Hungarian government introduced additional levies for foreign companies, and Austrian banks, mobile operators, and large retail chains were hit. The Hungarian government is filling its budget this way to avoid raising taxes for its own citizens, but Austrian companies are outraged. Logically, this issue became one of the central topics during the Hungarian politician's visit. Unfortunately, without results. Magyar stated that his government cannot yet abolish the Sondersteuern because Hungary first needs to stabilize its state budget. So Austrian businesses will have to wait a bit longer. Meanwhile, not everything is smooth in Austria's domestic politics either. Imagine that a loud scandal erupted in Parliament over a single word: remigration. During a session, deputy from the FPÖ party, Freedom Party of Austria, Susanna Fürst, used this term, and the President of Parliament, Walter Rosenkranz, did not reprimand her. Representatives of other parties, SPÖ and Grüne, Social Democratic Party and Greens, were outraged. When Doris Burgess from the Social Democrats took over chairing the session and the word remigration was used again by Susanna Fürst, she immediately issued an official warning, Ordnungsruf, call to order. It seems like a strange event and just a trifle, so let's briefly understand what the problem is with this word. Remigration in itself is an ordinary scientific term meaning the voluntary return of migrants to their homeland. However, far-right movements, and not only in Austria, have long been using it as a cover for the idea of forced deportation of foreigners, refugees, and even citizens of the country who, in the radicals' opinion, have poorly integrated. It got to the point that a few years ago in neighboring Germany, linguists even declared remigration the anti-word of the year. It was heard so often from radicals. And this is precisely what outraged some Austrian deputies. Doris Burgess reminded everyone that radicals hide the concept of forced deportation behind this term, and such words should not be heard in Austria's parliament. So, as we can see, the migration topic is so acute that a real scandal erupted in Parliament over one word.
Another big news story of the past week is the Vienna trial. On May 20th, it handed down a verdict in one of Austria's loudest espionage scandals. Former intelligence officer Egisto Ott, who spied for Russia, ended up behind bars. This man worked in Austrian counterintelligence and had access to all secret police databases. There, he searched for information about people Moscow was interested in: politicians, journalists, and Russian opposition figures. For this data, he naturally received money. For example, it has been proven that Ott sold a highly protected German Sina laptop to Russia's FSB for €20,000. This is a military computer used by EU governments for encrypted communications. Rot passed secret data to the Russians through an intermediary, Jan Marsalek, who managed to flee to Russia and now lives there under the protection of intelligence services. At trial, Rot said he did nothing of the sort, and that it was supposedly a special operation together with Western intelligence services. But prosecutors showed correspondence, money in accounts, evidence that he illegally checked people through closed databases, and ultimately, Rot received 49 months in prison. That is, just over 4 years behind bars. The spy himself did not admit his guilt, and his lawyers have filed an appeal, so this is probably not the end of the spy's story yet. Another important topic of the past week will affect many families where sons are growing up. So, political disputes around the reform of compulsory military service, Wehrpflicht, military service, have been ongoing in Austria for almost 4 months. 3 government parties, ÖVP, SPÖ, and NEOS, Austrian People's Party, Social Democratic Party, and NEOS, cannot reach an agreement. Military experts and Defense Minister Claudia Tanner are sounding the alarm. They say it's simply impossible to train a soldier in modern defense in the current 6 months. Therefore, the army demands radical changes. Extend conscription to 8 months and return mandatory 2-month military assemblies for reservists. Accordingly, alternative civilian service, Zivildienst, civilian service, would grow from 9 months to a full year. But there's complete division in the government. The Chancellor wants to push through this reform and even proposed holding a nationwide referendum. However, his coalition partners, the Social Democrats and Liberals from NEOS, blocked the voting idea and don't want to forcibly take additional time from young people. Moreover, to change the terms of civilian service, a 2/3 majority in parliament is needed, which the government doesn't have without the opposition. Since politicians can't agree, the army simply won't have time to launch the new rules from January 2027 as planned. So the draft remains old for now, but it's obvious that in the future, service will be longer. And to wrap up the review of the week's main news, we finally have positive news. Austria has once again entered the top 10 best countries in the world according to US News and World Report. If you break down this ranking into details, it becomes clear what areas the country received such high marks for. Expectedly, the main trump card is stability. In the categories social protection and security, Austria scored almost the maximum 96 points out of 100. Analysts also gave very high marks to the Austrian healthcare system and the level of business transparency. But there are also areas where the country is clearly lagging. Austria received the worst marks for so-called economic dynamism and readiness for innovation. Here, experts note that the country is too conservative and slow to implement changes. However, in terms of income per capita and overall sense of comfort, the country confidently stays alongside the ranking leaders, Switzerland and Denmark. On this positive note, the main news of the week is exhausted, and we'll continue the episode and in just a moment tell you about everything related to economics and finance.
So, on May 22nd, the Nationalrat, National Council, approved an important decision. From July 1st, Mehrwertsteuer, value-added tax, VAT, will decrease. The new rate is almost 5% instead of 10% on such products. Milk, butter, eggs, rice, wheat flour, pasta, bread, most vegetables and some fruits, for example, apples, pears, peaches. Thanks to this, according to the Ministry of Finance's calculations, the average household will save about €100 per year. This is not a large sum, but with inflation running high, every euro matters. What does this mean for you? From July, you'll see slightly lower prices in supermarkets on these basic goods. These aren't drastic improvements, but let's say a step in the right direction. Another piece of news that directly concerns prices in stores and your wallets. The Austrian government has decided to fight hard against sellers who mislead buyers. At a Council of Ministers meeting, Ministerrat, Council of Ministers, large-scale changes to the Price Labeling Act, Preiszeichnungsgesetz, were approved. Previously, the maximum penalty for incorrectly indicating a price was symbolic and amounted to only €1,450. Now this fine has been raised almost tenfold, up to €15,000. The new system of punishments works in clear stages. When inspectors detect the first violation, the store is given an official warning and time to correct the errors. If during a repeat inspection it turns out that the violations have not been corrected, the supermarket will be fined. The most severe punishment will be for systematic fraud. In this case, the fine is issued immediately without any warnings, up to €3,750 per product, with a maximum limit of €15,000. In addition, such a store loses the right to the first free warning for 1 year. Why are these changes really important for every buyer? Supermarkets often use Preistrickserei, price tricks, price traps. They hang large posters about discounts that are actually fake, or deliberately indicate the wrong base price per kilogram or liter, making it difficult for people to compare the actual cost of goods. Control authorities have already gone on mass raids, and not without results. In Vienna alone, in 1 month of inspections, inspectors drew up about 200 violation reports. So if you notice a suspicious price on the shelf, you can, and even should, complain.
Meanwhile, on May 21st, the European Commission published its spring forecast, and Austria's indicators are among the worst in the European Union. This year, the country's economy will grow by only 0.6%, while the average indicator for the entire EU is almost twice as high. There are 3 main reasons for this slowdown. First, expensive energy carriers due to the conflict in the Middle East. Second, less Austrian goods are being bought abroad. And third, a prolonged crisis in the construction industry. Because of this, inflation will also fall slowly. This year, it will be 3%, and next year, 2.5%. The budget deficit in the next 2 years will exceed 4% of the country's entire gross product, so the state's debts will grow. For the lives of ordinary people, these figures mean quite specific consequences. A weak economy means fewer jobs, wages grow more slowly, and the state cuts spending. Also, according to experts, you need to be prepared for the fact that competition in the labor market will remain high. And in addition to general economic problems, the government is shutting down some of its high-profile digital projects. The Ministry of Finance has completely canceled the planned receipt lottery, Beleglotterie, receipt lottery, which was supposed to start in October and encourage people to use digital receipts. The idea was that people who submit their receipts through the Finanz online tax system would automatically participate in a monthly lottery, with prizes of €2,500 for 100 winners and bonus prizes of €250,000. The initiative looked good. You submit receipts, fight tax fraud, and can even win money. However, the ministry decided that there are other, more effective methods for fighting tax fraud and encouraging digitalization, and it's not expedient to spend budget money on lottery prizes. In essence, nothing critical changes for ordinary residents. There will be no lottery, but digital receipts will still be introduced throughout the country as part of overall digitalization. It's just that now, for collecting and submitting receipts, you won't get a chance to win money, but will do it simply as an ordinary taxpayer's duty. And we conclude the economics news with an important event. Although the overall economic forecast is rather disappointing, in the energy sector, Austria recently received a significant advantage. On May 19th, the Austrian energy company OMV, the country's largest oil and gas company, announced the commissioning of the largest gas field in Austria in the last 40 years. It was launched in Lower Austria, near Vienna, in the municipality of Wittau. The well was drilled to a record depth, 5,000 meters. The company says this field will help partially reduce the country's dependence on imported gas. Experts estimate its reserves at 28 terawatt-hours. This will allow the country to immediately increase its own production by 50% and independently cover about 15% of Austria's total annual gas consumption. Why is this important? Although Austria is not a major gas producer, every new field is a step towards energy independence. Gas prices directly affect heating prices in winter and electricity, so if the country produces more of its own gas, this can restrain price growth. These were the main financial news items, and next in the episode, we'll talk about changes that will directly affect the lives of foreigners and integration in Austria.
So, Burgenland has introduced new rules for asylum seekers. Now, they are required to work on community jobs. This is no longer a voluntary program, as it was previously in most regions of Austria, but an official obligation. If a person receives basic social assistance from the state, free housing, food, and medical care, they must work for the community. What exactly should they do? Clean streets and territories, clear snow in winter, maintain parks, lawns, and sports fields. They may also be involved in small household or courier tasks, or help at local cultural events. For each hour of such work, they pay €1.60. This is not a salary in the usual sense, but a symbolic addition to the social assistance people already receive. The schedule is as follows. Single people without family obligations work up to 30 hours per week, and those who have children or care for relatives, up to 20 hours. If a person repeatedly fails to show up for work without a valid reason, their monthly financial support can be significantly reduced. In some cases, authorities can even take away free housing and cancel part of other social guarantees. Local authorities believe that mandatory work helps foreigners integrate into society faster, improves German language skills through daily practice, and gives opportunities to communicate with local residents. However, the new system has caused controversy. Some locals criticize the reform, calling it a hidden form of cheap forced labor or wage dumping. €1.60 per hour is extremely little, even taking into account free housing and food. Others, on the contrary, fully support the initiative and believe that without constant employment, migrants remain isolated in their dormitories for years and don't adapt to life in the country at all. In addition, after launching this model in Burgenland, other federal states are also interested. Carinthia and Styria are already preparing similar strict legislative changes. What does this mean for you? If you're an asylum seeker and live in Burgenland, be prepared that state services will soon involve you in mandatory community work. If you live in another federal state of Austria, watch local news carefully, because similar rules may be introduced in your region.
Meanwhile, on May 19th, Lower Austria presented a new integration code, Integrationskodex, Integration Code, which seriously tightens requirements for migrants. What is this exactly? The Integration Code is an official document that establishes rules and expectations regarding how migrants should integrate into Austrian society. The new code replaces the old guidelines that had been in effect since 2012 and were considered too soft. It was presented by Provincial Councillor Martin Antauer from the FPÖ party, which traditionally advocates for tougher migration policy. The main change: The German language is now officially defined as the central priority of integration. The code directly emphasizes that knowledge of German is not just a useful skill, but an absolute key to successful integration in the country. What specifically changes? The code establishes stricter requirements for learning the German language for all migrants living in Lower Austria. This means that you will be expected not just to attend some courses for show, but to make real progress in language proficiency. In addition to language, the new code emphasizes the need to adhere to Austrian values and actively participate in the life of local communities. For now, details of exactly how this will all be monitored and what sanctions will be for non-compliance are still being clarified. But the general trend is absolutely clear. Throughout Austria, requirements for migrants are becoming increasingly strict, and Lower Austria is not an exception here, but rather one of the leaders of this process. If you live in this region, you will be expected to study German more actively and productively. This is not just a recommendation, but an official requirement enshrined in the provincial code. But there is also positive news. Vienna is preparing more specialists to improve the level of German among migrant children. The city is seriously expanding the team of educators, Sprachförderpädagogen, language support educators, who help children learn German in kindergartens. Why is this so important? Statistics show that many children from migrant families come to first grade without knowing enough German for normal learning. This creates a huge problem from the very start. Children don't understand the teacher, can't complete assignments, and quickly fall behind classmates. And then catching up with this gap becomes harder and harder with each year. That's why the city decided to act proactively and invest money in language support at the kindergarten level before the child goes to school. The city is preparing a larger team of qualified specialists who will work in kindergartens from the beginning of 2026. These educators will help children master German through games, communication, and special exercises, so that by the time they enter school, their language level is sufficient for learning. If your child attends kindergarten in Vienna, this is really good news. More specialists means more attention to each child, more German classes, and better chances that your child will master the language at the proper level on time. This will give them the opportunity to successfully study in school on par with Austrian children, rather than struggle with a language barrier in every lesson. This is one of the few examples where tightening integration requirements is accompanied by real state support and investment in education, and not just punishments, fines, and restrictions. So if you're parents of a preschool child in Vienna, be sure to find out at your kindergarten whether there are these German language specialists and how your child can get additional support. So, we've dealt with important changes, and next, we move on to news from the capital.
So, new demographic statistics have appeared showing serious changes in the capital's population composition. Women in Vienna are giving birth later and later, and generally less often. The birth rate is lower than the Austrian average. At the same time, the majority of women in Vienna give birth between 30 and 34 years old, or even later. Researchers explain this by the high proportion of women with higher education who first build careers. Here are some interesting figures. 58% of children born in Vienna in 2024 have mothers who were themselves born abroad. The largest group is women from Syria, followed by women from Germany, Romania, Bosnia, and Turkey. For comparison, on average in Austria, the share of migrant mothers is 36%. Among women around 45 years old, approximately 20% remain childless, and among those born after 1990, this proportion may exceed 25%. A big problem is money. By age 18, expenses for a child average about 100,000 euros. And this is without taking into account income losses due to part-time work. This poses a difficult task for Vienna's authorities. On the one hand, a modern woman has every right to decide when and whether to become a mother, and on the other hand, the demographic crisis remains one of the main problems. Meanwhile, the capital is discussing a reform that could make Viennese taxis purple, and this has already caused a scandal. Vienna's deputy mayor and city councillor for economy, Barbara Novak, proposed making all Viennese taxis one color, because right now, tourists often don't even notice them on the street. City authorities thought it would be great if taxis became such a brand mark as yellow cars in New York or the famous black cabs in London. The idea is good, but there was a problem with color choice. Barbara Novak said in an interview that she likes purple and called it a nice feminist color, and it was precisely this phrase that caused a storm of emotions. Purple is the official color of the football club Austria Wien, one of the two biggest clubs in the capital. Their most principled rivals are the club Rapid Wien, whose fans wear green and white colors. These two teams are bitter rivals, and their fans literally hate each other's colors. When Rapid fans heard about purple taxis, they logically became outraged. On social media, the term rapid shock, even appeared. People joked that they would categorically not get into a taxi the color of their sports rivals and would rather walk home. But the reform isn't just about color. There are plans to seriously raise standards across the entire industry. This includes strengthening control over cleanliness and technical condition of cars, raising passenger service standards, more complex exams for taxi drivers, and many other changes. So the color issue is actually secondary, but the discussion about purple taxis has already become one of the week's most talked about city topics. Meanwhile, Vienna will ban old clothing containers on municipal lands. On May 22nd, news appeared that the capital is introducing a ban on placing old clothing containers, Altkleidercontainer, used clothing containers, on city territories. Often such containers become a source of disorder. Garbage accumulates around them. People throw anything there, not just clothes. They spoil the city's appearance and turn into spontaneous dumps. And sometimes they're used by dubious organizations that hide behind charity but actually profit from reselling clothes. Therefore, from now on, the containers themselves won't disappear. But city authorities will much more strictly control who exactly and where can place them. Preference will be given to reliable, verified, charitable organizations that work transparently. If you regularly donate old clothes, look for official collection points from verified organizations such as Caritas or Rotes Kreuz, Red Cross. And it's better not to throw things in any random containers, because you might just sponsor someone's business under the guise of charity. And to conclude the Capital News block, a curious story about how in Vienna they fined for too loud music in the car. Vienna police fined a driver 165 euros for listening to music in the car too loudly. A patrol noticed a car from which music was blaring throughout the area, stopped it, and wrote a fine for disturbing public order. According to Austrian legislation, drivers are required to control the volume level so that music doesn't interfere with other road users and doesn't disturb residents' peace. If music can be heard dozens of meters away or it interferes with hearing emergency sirens, this is a violation. Police decided that in this case, the volume was unacceptable and wrote the fine. The driver wasn't thrilled, but the law is the law. So if you like to drive with music, watch the volume, especially in residential areas and late in the evening.
165 euros for a favorite song is expensive, so it's better to turn down the sound and listen so that the music doesn't escape beyond your car. These were all the important capital events, and in a moment we'll briefly tell you about what happened in the federal states last week.
A loud political scandal erupted in Lower Austria over teenage crime. The federal state's vice governor, Udo Landbauer, is demanding a radical tightening of laws against youth gangs of migrants. The reason for the loud statement was an incident in the town of Ebrechtsdorf. There, a group of teenagers of foreign origin intimidated local children and in April attacked a 9-year-old girl and threatened her with a knife. Police have already identified several suspects. The main problem for the investigation is that most of the attackers are younger than 14 years old. Under Austrian law, they are not subject to criminal liability. Because of this, politicians from the right-wing party FPÖ are demanding to immediately lower the age of criminal responsibility in the country. There are also calls to completely stop accepting new refugees and start remigration, which we already mentioned today. For now, the politicians' proposals are just calls, not decisions adopted by the government. However, such incidents accelerate the adoption of real decisions, so we advise you to follow the news. Meanwhile, Carinthia became the first region to open a fueling station for hydrogen buses. 35 new eco-friendly vehicles are ready to go out on regular routes in the state's cities. This type of transport doesn't pollute the air at all and doesn't create harmful smog. Instead of dirty exhaust from pipes, they only produce ordinary water vapor. In addition, refueling a bus with hydrogen takes only a few minutes. Now the region has received a ready technology that will allow transporting thousands of passengers without burning gasoline or diesel, improve ecology, and probably save money in the future. From Carinthia, we move to East Tyrol, where a popular hiking trail along the Isel River is being urgently relocated to another location. The reason for this decision is unusual: regular attacks by cows on tourists. Literally, this past weekend, several hikers were injured on alpine pastures near the trail. The cows were apparently protecting calves, and city tourists seemed suspicious to them. In Austria, similar conflicts between hikers and farm livestock occur regularly. According to local laws, farmers are personally responsible for any damage on their territory. If a cow injures a person, the owner can receive a huge monetary fine or even face criminal charges. Therefore, municipalities try to act proactively and simply physically separate people and livestock. That's what they did this time too. The Tourist Association in East Tyrol has already started installing special warning signs, and the hiking trail will temporarily go around via a safe asphalt bike path. And for those who love mountain walks, we remind you, keep maximum distance from cows. Don't try to pet calves. If it so happens that an animal has noticed you and become interested, don't panic, shout, or wave your arms. Just start slowly and calmly moving aside. This way, both you and the cow will remain intact. Well, and to conclude the episode, an instructive and somewhat amusing story from Tyrol that also reminds about strict Austrian rules. So, a local resident, owner of a dachshund dog, was called to the police for a serious check because the dog was riding with the owner in the car and was not fastened with a safety belt. Yes, that's exactly what happened. The woman was just driving on her errands, and her small, four-legged favorite was sitting freely in the back seat. This picture was noticed by an attentive driver of another car who was driving behind, and he immediately recorded the violation on his mobile phone. The witness didn't hesitate and passed this video recording to law enforcement as evidence of the offense. Police identified the owner by the car's license plates and sent her a summons for questioning. And although the situation is rather funny, its consequences are absolutely serious. The woman faces a solid fine for violating road safety rules. The fact is that according to local laws, any pets in a car are officially considered cargo. Accordingly, the driver is required to securely fasten such cargo so it doesn't fly around the cabin during sudden braking. For example, for safely transporting dogs in Austria, you need to use special car safety belts, strong nets, or closed transport boxes. And you shouldn't think this is an exaggeration. Even the smallest and calmest dog without fixation can be seriously injured itself or injure people in the car. So such rules make sense. If you travel around the country by car with a dog, be sure to think about safety for both yourself and the animal. Otherwise, an ordinary trip to the store can end with an unpleasant visit to the police and an empty wallet. And next, to conclude the episode, we'll briefly tell you about the most interesting events from Austria's cultural life.
Austria achieved victory in Cannes. Director Sandra Wollner took the main prize in the prestigious Un certain regard program of the Cannes Film Festival for her new film, Every Time. To understand the context, Austria has never been a cinema monster. They don't make blockbusters here, and local cinemas are usually filled with American releases. Victories of Austrian cinema at such large-scale festivals are not written about often. The last undoubtedly stellar Austrian director was Michael Haneke, who took 2 Golden Palm branches. However, his cinema, as they say, is not for everyone. Sandra Wollner is a worthy student of this school. Her previous film was even banned at some festivals due to 2 scandalous themes, and the new film about a mother who loses a child is also unlikely to become a hit in cinemas. Nevertheless, to understand Austrian contemporary cinema, it's worth watching the film. Meanwhile, on May 22nd, the opening ceremony of the 75th anniversary festival, Wiener Festwochen, Vienna Festival Weeks, took place in Vienna. And the headliner was the legendary American singer and rock icon Patti Smith. This is a living legend of rock music. Wiener Festwochen is one of the largest cultural festivals not only in Austria, but in all of Europe. The festival includes theatrical performances, operas, dances, concerts, and performances by artists from around the world. The 75th anniversary festival is held under the slogan, Republic of Gods. The festival will run until June 21st. If you live in the capital and want to feel the spirit of the city, visit at least one festival event. Many events are free or have affordable tickets, and this is a great opportunity to get acquainted with Austrian and world culture. Another event will take place in just a few days in the Austrian town of Bad Aussee in Styria. From May 28th to 31st, the Daffodil Festival is held there. They don't just arrange flowers there. They build giant figures, each of which requires hundreds of thousands of buds. In addition to these floral installations, the festival will have a lot of everything, from the election of the Daffodil Queen to evening shows in national costumes and orchestra performances. May 31st is the main day, with a fair and street festivities. If you're planning to go, a ticket costs €19, but children under 15 get free entry. If you drive there by car, along the way you can see neighboring lakes, Hallstatt and Altausee. Right there in Altausee, there are old salt mines where you can also go on an excursion. And in Salzburg, they launched a leisure project right in the city. Queer_Beat. These are open-air concerts that take place every Wednesday. Locations are constantly changing, and entry is absolutely free. The full schedule of events with dates and locations is available on the city's official tourism portal, salzburg.info.
This concludes today's episode. Thank you for being with us this week. We will continue to keep you informed about the most important events. Subscribe to the weekly podcast Rot-Weiss-Rot REPORT, a podcast for those who live and work in Austria. We're on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify. That's all. We'll hear you in a week.